Penguin Random House Audio presents A Spell of Good Things by Ayobami Adebayo. Read for you by Apampa and Babajide Oyekunle. Kinsman. When an elephant walks over a hard rock outcrop, we do not see his footprints. When a buffalo walks over a hard rock outcrop, we do not see his footprints. Kinsman and Foreman by T.M. Aluko. Carol was angry. After one of her apprentices read the notice of the meeting out loud to her, she threw it across the room into a dustbin. Some politician's wife wanted to give a talk to the Tailoring Association, and their president had agreed to welcome the woman during their next meeting. And, of course, the president thought it meant something to mention that this politician's wife was the daughter of a tailor. Carol was almost sure this was a lie. Those people would claim to be your kinsmen if it would help them get into power. It irritated her that they would waste time listening to this woman campaigning for her husband. This was not why she paid her tailoring association dues. Carol went to the dustbin in the corner of her tailoring shop. She retrieved the notice, tore it into tiny bits, and walked to her front yard to release the fragments in the air. She would let the association know what she thought at the next meeting. Not that anyone would listen or care. They all knew their president took money from politicians to host them at those gatherings. Closer to the elections, members of the association would get their own share of the sudden generosity of several contestants. Wives or sisters of contestants would come to the meetings with bowls of rice, kegs of oil, yards and yards of Ankara embossed with contestants' faces and logos. The men themselves, and the contestants were mostly men, never came in person to answer any questions about what they intended to do in office. Some of the other tailors accused Carol of arrogance because she always refused to take the rice and oil or to sew a dress from the useless Ankara fabrics. But she did not feel superior to any of them. Most, if not all, had children to feed with the foodstuff. Besides, they knew this was all they could be sure of getting out of the politicians for another 4 years. So why not gorge on the rice and the oil they brought if that was the only so-called dividend of democracy within reach? Carol understood the reasoning of her peers, but that did not make the whole thing less enraging. How many times had the representatives of those politicians promised that electricity would be fixed if only their candidate got into office? Wasn't everyone in the Tailoring Association still dependent on generators? Was it not just 2 weeks ago that one of them had died in her sleep after inhaling generator fumes? The third tailor to die that way in as many years. At the latest news, Carol could not cry. Instead, even though the dead woman was someone whose face she could barely remember, her head had pulsed with rage for days. Elections were coming up in a year or so. In the next few months, campaign posters would begin to appear, littering every fence and wall in sight with the faces of men whose smiles already showed they should not be trusted. Last time, her wall had been covered from top to bottom with some senators' campaign posters because her front yard faced the street. She must remember to ask someone to paint post-no bills on the wall soon. She'd ask one of her apprentices, probably Eniola. Part 1. Everything good will come. Muffled rage stalks like the wind, sudden and invisible. People don't fear the wind until it fells a tree. Then they say it's too much. Everything Good Will Come by Sefi Atta.
1. Eniola decided to pretend it was just water. A single melting hailstone. Mist, or do. Could also be some good thing, a solitary raindrop falling from the sky, lone precursor to a deluge. The first rains of the year would mean he could finally eat an agbalumo. The fruit seller, whose store was next to his school, had a basket of agbalumo for sale yesterday, but Eniola had not bought any from her, and he'd convinced himself this was because his mother often said it caused cramps if eaten before the first rainfall. But if this liquid was rain, then in a few days he could lick an agbalumo's sweet and sticky juice from his fingers, chew the fibrous flesh into gum, crack open the seeds, and give his sister seedlings that he'd halve into stick-on earrings. He tried to pretend it was just rain, but it did not feel like water. He could sense, though his eyes were downcast, that the dozen or so men who clustered around the newspaper vendor's table were staring at him. They were all quiet, stone still, like disobedient children transformed into rocks by an evil wizard in one of those stories his father used to tell. When he was a child, Eniola would shut his eyes whenever he got into trouble, certain that he was not visible to anyone he could not see. Although he knew closing his eyes now and hoping he would vanish was as stupid as believing people could become stones, he squeezed them shut anyway. And of course, he did not vanish. He was not that lucky. The newspaper vendor's rickety table was still right in front of him, close enough for his thighs to brush the newspapers that covered its surface. The vendor, whom Eniola called Egmoabi, was still standing next to him, and the hand he'd pressed into Eniola's shoulder just before he cleared his throat and spat in his face was still in place. Eniola traced a finger up his nose, inching towards the wet weight of phlegm. Stunned to silence that something so unexpected had rippled through their routine, all the men, even Egmoabi, seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for more. Not even one person was stunting Chelsea fans about the way Tottenham crushed their team last night. Nobody was arguing about that open letter the journalist politician had written about other politicians who bathed in human blood to protect themselves from evil spirits. The men had all gone quiet when the vendor's phlegm struck Eniola's face, and now these men who gathered here every morning to argue about the headlines were watching to see what Eniola would do. They wanted him to hit the vendor, yell insults, cry, or better yet, clear his own throat, pull phlegm in his mouth, and spit in Egbabe's face. Eniola's finger traveled all the way to his forehead. He had been too slow. The phlegm had already dribbled down the side of his nose, leaving a damp and sticky trail across his cheek. Flicking the glove away was out of the question now. Something pushed against his cheek. He flinched, lurching forward into the newspaper stand. Around him, a few people muttered, "Sorry," as he gripped the table's edge to stop himself from falling. One of the men had been pushing a blue handkerchief against his face. "Nshesa," Eniola said as he took the handkerchief. He was grateful, even though the hanky was already streaked with white lines that flaked when he pressed it against his cheek. Eniola scanned the small crowd, straightening once he realized there was no one there from his school. The men clustered around the vendor's table were all adults, some already dressed for work, pulled at tightly knotted ties, and adjusted ill-fitting jackets. Many wore faded sweaters or bomber jackets zipped chin-high. Most of the younger ones, whose names he had to prefix with brother or get a knock on the head, were recent graduates from polytechnics or universities. They would loiter around Egmoabe's stand all morning, reading and arguing, copying job adverts from the newspapers into notepads or scraps of paper. Now and then, they might help the vendor with change, but none of them would buy a newspaper. Eniola tried to return the handkerchief, but the man waved him off and began browsing through a copy of Alaroye. At least there was no one here who could tell his schoolmates how the vendor had glared at him for almost a full minute before spitting in his face. The actual
Sample complete. Ready to continue?